Since ChatGPT was launched back in November, journalists have been discussing its potential impact on the news industry. So how many journalists perhaps may be replaced by the rise of generative artificial intelligence, and how fast will this process take place if indeed it does happen? To try to help us answer some of these questions, let's bring in Professor Herman Wasserman, who's the chair of the Department of Journalism at Stellenbosch University. Prof, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time to chat to us. And as part of our chat, let's speak about what ChatGPT actually is, because I don't want to take it for granted that people know what this platform actually does.
Well, ChatGPT is called a large language model type of artificial intelligence, which can produce or gather information at a very fast pace. Any information that's out there on the internet can respond to prompts, so you can ask it certain questions and it will scour the data that it has available to construct an answer or a story for you. And that can be in the form of a song or an essay or a news report or a poem. So it has quite amazing capabilities in terms of being able to gather data and put it in a specific format.
Right. Those who've been writing extensively about this say that it's incredibly good at essentially imitating human behavior. And that's where the interesting discussions start creeping in, right? So, yes, it can imitate behavior, but, I mean, can it actually speak to the fundamentals, for example, of what good journalism is actually about? This truth-seeking motive, for example, being able to triangulate different pieces of information?
Well, it depends on what you mean by imitating human behavior. I mean, it cannot, it is not human. It cannot create something original. What it does is it uses vast amounts of data to put something together out of what already exists. And in that regard, I mean, it predicts sort of language. So it can, in other words, imitate, I would say, imitate certain forms of writing and does so very well. It can imitate a journalistic report, it can imitate a story. So certain forms of journalism is, of course, sort of repetitive and routine and often puts together information from a press release or from data that is available, sports results, and so on. And you know, if you were to ask ChatGPT, write me a report on, some of the rugby report yesterday or the results or something, it could bring that information back to you and tell you what happened. But what it cannot do is create something new. It cannot go and find information like a journalist can. It cannot contextualize it. It's unable to ask sort of critical questions of information. And I think that is where journalists' role really lies, in that sense, contextualization, the unearthing of information, the exposing of for instance, hidden information. That sort of thing, I think, is increasingly going to be the important roles that are left for journalists.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like we've been here, Prof, doesn't it? I mean, it feels like these are the kind of discussions we're having at the onset of social media, right? Whether or not this kind of powerful tool is going to hurt or help journalism. What's your take on ChatGPT's role? Oh, what a pity. It looks like we've potentially lost our connection to Professor Herman Wasserman. Hopefully not ChatGPT getting in the way. We'll try re-establish that connection for you because, once again, I find it fascinating, this platform where essentially you could ask it questions and it responds to you. Perhaps Siri is the closest example we have that of artificial intelligence that's able to interact with humans at a very realistic level, by the way. And it's obviously raised questions about whether or not some jobs, like mine potentially, may become redundant, right? Whether or not you need somebody on your TV screen to tell you what's happening in the world, if a computer perhaps may be able to do the same thing. Hopefully we'll be able to get the Prof back, because I'm not sure if he is back just yet, but when we do, we'll be able to continue that discussion for you. But in the meantime, here's other news. The DA's head of policy, that's Gwen Ngwenya, resigning from her position for a second time. This comes as the party prepares to hold its federal Congress next Saturday. Ngwenya revealed on Twitter this morning that she's taken a role at Airbnb to lead the company's policy and legislative activities across Africa and the Middle East. Ngwenya first left the DA following BEE disputes with former DA leader Musi Maimane, and that was in 2019. She later returned to the party after he left. All right, let's take you back to our discussion with Professor Herman Wasserman with Stellenbosch University as we're unpacking the potential impact that ChatGPT may have specifically on journalism. And Prof, once again, thanks for staying on. I think you had been lost to us as I was asking the question around whether or not we've been here before when we're trying to make sense of social media and ways through which it might potentially hurt or help journalism. On which realm do you reckon ChatGPT falls, or is it still too early to tell?
Well, I think it is too early to tell exactly what the ramifications of it would be, but you're right in the sense that there's usually a sort of panic around new technologies. And that was the case with, you can go back to radio, to television, to mobile phones, social media, because people don't know what to make of it and what its impact will be. And I think that is, again, the case with these AI models. They often, have both a good side and a sort of bad side. And it often depends on how they are used and also not necessarily what they do to us, but what we do with them and how we use them. And I think journalists can use ChatGPT and other forms of AI to their benefit to maybe cut out some of the routine work, to maybe write a quick draft or whatever. But it is important to understand that it makes mistakes. And it is not infallible. So something like ChatGPT, you would still have to fact check it and make sure that all the information is correct. So it has its limitations, but I'm sure you'll be able to use it as well to your benefit. But I think those core functions of journalism, the truth seeking, the fact checking, the corroboration, the original information that you produce, that is obviously something that AI would not be able to do. It just regurgitates information that is already there. Yeah,
it's fascinating. So the fundamentals of journalism stay the same, whether we go from moving from radio to television, moving from facts to tweets. There are still those important who, what, when, why, how questions that hopefully we're continuing to ask. But it does make things interesting for the demographics of newsrooms, doesn't it? I mean, when social media came about, suddenly newsrooms were taking it a whole lot more seriously, their ability to be active on those platforms, and typically that means getting perhaps younger people into that space. Do you reckon we need to visit those conversations again in order to, integrate ChatGPT if indeed we do go in that direction?
Yes, I think that's an interesting point, that it shows the importance for journalism also to draw on different sets of expertise, people with different skill sets, and certainly I think AI is a game changer. It will probably amplify, it can amplify some of the good aspects, but it can also amplify things like disinformation. And so it's definitely an important force to reckon with. And I think, whether these are younger people or people with different skill sets, people maybe more versed in AI and other sorts of technologies, I think journalism will definitely have to take stock of what it means. Also, what are the skills that a journalist requires to work in this new space. So I think it will pose a challenge for newsrooms, for newsroom management, for newsroom training, for journalism training, and for this just general public to understand and be critical about the information that they receive in order to know what is fact and fiction and be able to corroborate information. So it does, I think, pose interesting questions and interesting challenges going forward. But there's no way of denying it, or we can't skirt it. We'll have to engage with it critically.
Yeah, and hopefully we do so sober-mindedly, because another point of anxiety, let's call it, around social media was around, questions of jurisdiction, right? So if I tweet something that breaks the law in a neighboring country, but it's retweeted here in South Africa where that law isn't necessarily in existence, there were questions around how you deal with that, legally speaking. Have you thought around any of these kind of complexities when it comes to ChatGPT, essentially the regulation of this platform across different countries?
Well, I think regulation is a thorny issue, across the board when you talk about regulation, moderation of social media platforms, for instance. And we have seen in recent times a sort of a clawing back of some of that moderation, for instance, on Twitter. And I think with the rise of these new technologies, it's very easy, not only something like ChatGPT, but you also have image generating software like DALL-E and Midjourney and so on. All these capabilities, I think, makes it really imperative for journalists, but also regulators, policymakers, to think very critically and very hard about how these platforms should be regulated. And that doesn't mean that they should necessarily only be limited, but I think it also raises questions around, for instance, media literacy training and disinformation literacy, something that I think should already be taught at schools, for instance, to make school learners who are very active on social media and on digital media aware of the dangers and the risks, but also of the potentialities of these technologies. So I think it is important that we also take stock of education of the broader public, because everybody is using media, everybody is increasingly able to access digital media and mobile media, and so this is not only a challenge for journalists and for regulators, it's a challenge for educators, parents, and so on. So it does pose interesting and important questions.
It's a good point, and I wonder whether you reckon we're getting any better at answering some of those questions or responding to those challenges. And I ask this, excuse my giggling, because of just how, the grilling of the TikTok CEO actually went in the U.S. The critics were saying, once again, legislators appeared to be completely out of their depth when you just listen to the line of questioning that they were putting towards the TikTok CEO about just the basics of how some of those platforms actually work.
Yes, I think policymakers, politicians have to be aware of how these platforms work, what they can do, what they can't do, and have to take seriously questions around regulation, moderation. Of course, in the context of TikTok, what we have there is also geopolitical questions around cybersecurity and information. But if we talk about access to people's data, it's not only TikTok. I mean, if you're on any of the meta platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, your data is also being harvested and used. And I think that's another aspect that is important for public education, to make people aware that if, especially they say, if something is free, then you are the product, then you are being sold, as it were. So it is important to make people aware of how their data is being used, what data they are sacrificing or offering, opening up online. And again, I think this is something that stresses the importance of a media literacy education for everybody, not only for journalists. Although journalists, of course, is a specific category of information workers and information producers. I think the role of journalists to help us make sense of this is going to be really important. And the role of journalists to also themselves be literate and educated in terms of these new developments.
Absolutely. It sounds like you're saying my job is still safe, so I'll take that for now. Professor Herman Wasserman, thanks for your time. Appreciate you helping us connect the dots.
Thank you.
He, of course, is the chair of the Department of Journalism at Stellenbosch University.